This is episode 77 of Changing the Face of Yoga, and I'm speaking to Mark Walsh of Embodied Yoga Principles. This is a particular way of doing yoga that he has created, and I think you'll find it interesting. Let's listen.
Hello, and welcome to Change the Face of Yoga, teaching toddlers through golden oldies. I'm very excited to be talking to lots of yoga teachers who will explain their passion for teaching yoga to students with different ages, physical fitness levels, wellness levels, and different goals. They will explain the benefits of yoga for these students and will be including teacher tips and pose modifications. I am Stephanie Cunningham of Yoga Lightness, and I've been teaching over 50s for 10 years. So this area is my passion and the passion of many other yoga teachers that you will be listening to in this series. Thank you so much for listening, and let's get started. Hello, this is Stephanie Cunningham, and I have a great guest today. His name is Mark Walsh, and Mark is the founder of the Embodied Facilitator Course and Embodied Yoga Principles. He's also a black belt and has participated in integration training. He's taught in 30 countries and made embodiment available online through a YouTube channel that has over 10 million hits. And I did watch some of those. He has a degree in psychology, a black belt, and has trained with various body-mind masters and in various approaches. So welcome, Mark. I'm really glad to have you today. It sounds like an interesting topic, one we haven't talked about. And is there anything you'd like to add to that introduction?
No, that's good. Happy to be here. Could add the founder of Embodiment podcast, or the Embodiment conference is a big thing we're putting on in November. Everything embodiment's generally my vibe.
Okay.
Lots of yoga, of course, as well.
Let's start there. Let's define embodiment according to your thing.
Yeah, this is a really good question because it's getting sort of used a lot now and hashtagged around the place. And, you know, this has been my life's work, really. So there's different ways of defining it. The simplest way would be the subjective aspect of the body. Even simpler, we could say how we are, the manner of our being as relates to the body. So not the body as an object or a brain taxi, as one of my colleagues says, but the body as a key part of who we are, the personal body, the subjective aspect of the body. That's the simplest way of defining it, as opposed to, you know, body as object, the sort of general way of looking at the body in the Western world. We could also see embodiment as a type of intelligence, or we could see it as an umbrella term for the different body-mind arts. So we could say, you know, yoga would be in there, martial arts, conscious dance, various kinds of body work, body psychotherapy, some kinds of improv, you know, they could be under this umbrella of embodied arts. So yeah, there's a few ways to define it.
Okay. And did you start with the black belt training? And then you went to embodiment, or?
Well, I started off with misery and failure. I started off being a very smart kid that got very miserable through realized the hard way that book learning alone wasn't enough, that I was a cognitively clever kid, but, you know, my life was a mess and I was a drug dealing, alcoholic, miserable, suicidal teenager. And I realized that, you know, hey, if I'm so smart, why am I so screwed up? And by the time I crawled into university at 18, I discovered the martial arts as a way to, I think on a deep level, as a way to be well. And there were some superficial benefits to it, given some of my then criminal activities. But it was actually just a deep yearning for some learning that couldn't be provided from a library. And I started with aikido while studying psychology. And, you know, I've been doing yoga as well since my teen years. And it spread to yoga and dance and body therapy and all the different, you know, things I mentioned before. When I went, hey, there's a lot of richness in here. There's a lot of beauty and something in this for me, first of all. And then eventually it was, well, can I teach other people this? This seems like good stuff.
Okay. So what can you learn from the embodiment principles that you couldn't learn in the library?
How to live.
There's a big one.
Any life skill. I mean, there's a different, Western culture tends to think about learning about things. And, you know, for example, you're in Australia, right? Like I could learn about Australia, but that's quite different from going there and experiencing it, which is what I did for the first time recently, actually. And My learning about Australia from a book is quite different from hanging out there and meeting people there and feeling the culture there. So in corporate world, I'd say leadership is definitely one you can't learn from a book. In yoga, I'm teaching basic practical life skills through yoga asana. That's the Embodied Yoga Principles, helping people get not only insights into themselves, but also something very practical there. Let's say I'm teaching stress management. It's like you can learn all the neuroscience theory about stress, but does that help you when you're under pressure? I used to work in war zones. I used to work at the top of abseil towers with children, helping them kind of climb up walls and things. And the theory of stress doesn't help that much in those situations, but practical embodied skills really do.
Okay, let's go there. I'm climbing up a tower, which probably wouldn't bother me too much unless you put me in a little tiny thing. But anyway, yeah. So what would help me there if I did start to feel stressed? From your embodied principles.
Something simple like relax your belly, engage peripheral vision. Now, if you've taught these skills before they go up the wall, that's a hell of a lot easier, but you can teach on the wall. It breathe, that's the thing that yoga teachers are hilariously paid to say on a regular basis, but it's still a very useful thing, reminding people to breathe. If they're on the ground, we can work a lot more with posture and structure, but, up a climbing wall, certainly breathing and relaxation are still possible. And then there's the social side. So as a teacher, for me, being calm and relaxed myself is the main thing that's going to influence, in this case, children going up a wall, or it might be humanitarian aid workers I was working with in Afghanistan, or business people who had just got a million emails to do. If I'm coaching them, then the main thing is if I'm stressed and, relaxed and grounded myself rather than stressed, that's going to have a social impact. And obviously every yoga teacher, I hope, knows this in terms of how they're teaching. You don't say, relax, please, relax. So, there's a few openers there. Okay.
So I watched your videos, some of them, not all of them. I mean, there's a whole bunch of them, but I watched
1,500.
Yeah. I don't claim to have watched every one, but I was interested in one, and it was a very short one. And you had some people, and you were having them extend out their arms to the side and get big, and and then you had them all scrunched up I thought it was really interesting that some of them felt very comfortable stretched out, very uncomfortable scrunched down, and then there were just the opposite. And so I was sitting there looking at that going, okay, now what will you do with that? How will they use that?
Yeah. So this is a really nice concrete example that I'm hoping listeners can relate to. So there's a number of poses in yoga, like Warrior 2, for example, where people have their arms outstretched, taking up space effectively. And this is physical, but what you'll see as a yoga teacher is that some people just aren't comfortable with it emotionally and psychologically. We could even say culturally, because this is different cross-culturally. It's different across social classes, genders, ethnic groups, generations. There's people who are more comfortable taking up space and being seen, and people who are far less comfortable doing that. And there's pros and cons to both. For example, there's a cultural piece in this. For example, many people from the United States are much more comfortable taking up space and being seen than, say, British or Japanese people, having worked in all those countries. And there's advantages to taking up space and being seen. There's positives in that, and then there's negatives in that. So manspreading is the sort of classic example of people sort of, but actually upper class spreading would be, I'd see that even more in the UK. So there's a number of, ways we could break this down. So the first thing is to become aware of your patterns, right? Because if you don't know you're doing something, you can't change it. This is something Moshe Feldenkrais said. So you have people standing these poses which are emotionally significant, as well as just, I'm assuming they just haven't got like a torn deltoid or something, right? And so they're emotionally tricky for some people and easy for others. They're comfortable for some and not for others. And that taking up space is just one of the 26 poses we use. There's also an equivalent one about being private and inwards looking. And then they might do both of those poses and say which is familiar, which is comfortable. And that's the first thing, is the awareness raising. And then the second piece is, what do you want to practice? And we can either do that in the moment, so like to take space on an interview, for example, if you had a guest who was just speaking all the time, not letting you get a question in, you might kind of step into that embodiment, or as a practice. And maybe you're someone that's just very shy as a person and needs to practice that. Does that make any sense, Stephanie?
No, it does. It does. So you, first of all, bring up their awareness of their patterns, which I think is a good idea. But then secondly, because what you're talking about, or what you talked about and what you sent to me, was getting yoga off the mat.
Yes, absolutely.
So what happens next to help them go, okay, this is what I do. I assume they have to make a decision about this is what I want to do or I don't want to do it. And then what's the next step after that?
Yeah, great question. So this is our whole thing, getting yoga off the mat, because I'm kind of basically beyond basic health, which, is important. We all need that. But beyond that, otherwise, why practice yoga? Like how flexible do you need to be? If you're flexible enough, you can pick up your phone when you drop it. You've probably got long enough hamstrings, right? So it's like, how many green smoothies do we need? How healthy do we need to be? Beyond sort of the basic health for life that, I hope I have. So the specific things we do, there's a whole bunch of them, but one would be this micro posture. So every posture, if it's done as an investigation of an archetype, we could say, has a small equivalent which you can do in daily life. Now, let's take Warrior Two, because most people have seen the classic Warrior Two. They can visualize that. Now, you can't, in the middle of a business meeting or in the middle of a discussion with your husband or children, just pull a cheeky Warrior Two. That's a bit weird. What you can do, however, is actually do a very small version of it. So you might put one foot slightly forward. You might straighten your spine a little bit, go into extension very slightly. You might extend your hands. You might focus your gaze, your drishti. So there's elements of that pose, for example, the gaze, the breath, the hands, which can be done in any position, walking, lying down, standing, sitting in a meeting, on a date, wherever, which can be engaged, particularly if you've kind of built that muscle through the regular practice. So that's the state regulation. That's the short-term thing we can do. And the long-term thing we can do is practice, right? And you see this time and time again. You practice with students and they just get better and better at taking up space through doing it, or through softening and relaxing if you're doing a yin practice. And they're building those skills, and then more importantly than the skills, their embodiment is changing, their way of being. And that kind of happens unconsciously anyway in yoga, but we can really speed that up and make it much more targeted.
Yeah, I find that yoga does do that very subtly, that you do change quite a bit over time, and it is subtle, so you may not realize it until you kind of look back and say, oh my gosh, how did that happen? So,
bit by bit.
Yeah, so what do you have a theory or an opinion on how that happens with yoga? Because I've done other things and I didn't really feel that.
There's a number of mechanisms, and none of them are unique to yoga. For example, I was studying through aikido. I have students who do dance and other body forms. Yoga, I think, is a great way. And, I do yoga, just regular postural hatha yoga myself nearly every day, and, 3 or 4 classes a week because I love it. It's a great mechanism. What we found, though, is it can be speeded up and made far more accurate to what you want to build. So first of all, you have to understand how it's working. Like some of it's just, for example, just being in a positive social environment with other people.
Yeah.
If you're around a yoga class, you're probably around a group of people who are at least trying to be ethical and healthy, for example. Not always in the modern context, but usually I think I'd still have some faith to say that. But then there's the other ways that it's working, so mindfulness is obviously a base, but becoming more mindful, and first of all of the body and the posture. But if we're becoming aware of the breath, then that's involved with emotions, that's involved with our levels of stress, that's involved with everything. And then specifically there are some chemical mechanisms around testosterone levels perhaps, or cortisol levels, things like that. We could look at that side of things. And then there's just having a practice, learning to trust yourself, turning up every day. There's a whole bunch of mechanisms. I wrote a little ebook called Making Yoga Meaningful. It's a slightly cocky title, but it kind of lays them out. If people are interested, they can find that free online. And it lays out a whole bunch more. But once you understand the mechanisms, you can make all those mechanisms much more effective. Because unfortunately, in Aikido, we used to talk about the black belt arsehole. Yeah. And this is the person that's done a lot of practice, and they can throw you around and put you in a strong wrist lock, but maybe they're still hitting their kids. Maybe they're still alcoholic, and it doesn't always translate that well. And I just really have made it my life's work to study how to make that really effective, that transfer off the mat, which does happen anyway, but can happen far more efficiently, if that's not a dirty word.
Okay. When you talk about off the mat, what would you say has been your most intense change from yoga, you personally, if you feel comfortable talking about that?
Yeah, it's hard to separate out yoga from all my embodied practice, which includes, sitting meditation and dance and martial arts and things. Well, first of all, I'm alive. I'm not a suicide, so that's a pretty big change, I would say. Yeah. That's good. And I'm sober, long-term sober, which is a big change. And I think intimacy would be another one. So the ability to be in an intimate, loving relationship, which, whether you like men, women, or dolphins, that is a really important thing for life. I would say, to be able to be intimate with people. And, first that requires self-care, intimacy with self, self-awareness, self-regulation. There's a whole bunch of skills that are needed for you to have a decent, long-term intimate relationship. So aside from sort of just survival and self-awareness, I'd go for the changes that it's hard to know because it's happened over a long time. I've done 20 years of this stuff now, right? But I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have such a good marriage if I didn't have those skills from embodied practice.
Those are pretty impressive skills. I mean, really. I mean, those are almost incredible skills if you feel that you didn't have them before. So I watched your videos, not all, but I watched your videos, and I'm just wondering, you're not really, at least the videos I watched, you really aren't into deep cueing. It's really pretty gentle, and it's just kind of getting there. And it's more, at least this is my interpretation, and please tell me if I got this right, is that you're looking for how are you feeling doing this, not are you doing it exactly this way.
Yeah, so there's a tendency in a lot of form-based arts, whether it be martial arts or yoga or even some dance forms, to obsess around form. So there's a trap of form, they call it in Buddhism. And this can just make people more and more neurotic and more controlling. And it isn't necessarily that helpful. So I look at postures like they have to be kind of good enough, right? So we're not injuring ourselves physically. And it's like the good enough parent, which is a psychotherapy concept. So a posture has to be good enough to be doing us some good, or in the case of embodied yoga principles, to be used as an inquiry. So the postures are a basis for self-awareness. Is it familiar? Is this feel, when you do warrior pose, like the first time I did warrior, in my life, like 20 years ago, I was like, wow, yeah, this is my bag. I've come home. And the person next to me was like, I hate this, and it was both of our first class. So that's the first thing to notice. And then we can make an inquiry out of it, which is, accessing that body wisdom of like, hey, where do I need this warrior quality in my life? Do I need this in my parenting or my business or my relationship? Where do I need this? And actually having an inquiry process where if the yoga's too hardcore physical, like hardcore hot yoga or something, or it's too prescriptive in terms of following a form, then we're tuning out of the body. We're just learning conformity to someone else's form. And there could be benefits in learning form in terms of discipline and, surrender and things like that. But if we're really wanting to access body wisdom, then too much intensity or too strict a form, I've found usually isn't helpful.
Okay. All right. Would you say that what I'm finding is that a lot of yoga teachers are kind of bringing in other forms of movement, Tai Chi, Qigong, whatever, and dance and stuff. I'm kind of wondering what we can learn as yoga people from other kinds of movement.
Yeah. I think the first thing is to sort of honor the traditions of yoga and say, yoga as is done, though many of the traditions aren't quite as old as people think, but yoga as it's been done for a while certainly has a lot in it, and it could be a lifetime study. So that's the first thing I'd acknowledge. And then I'd say, okay, is there also things to be learned from other disciplines? And my answer is that while yoga can include everything, often it doesn't. And for example, the Western traditions of body therapy or improv and theater, they add something, or the expressive arts of dance, they really add something that isn't necessarily there in, say, a classical Iyengar practice, though actually from reading some of the sort of really old tantric stuff, it might well have been there originally. So I think there's things we can add in. There's also cultural biases that we can look at depending on where the art comes from, whether it's Japan or Tibet or India or wherever, America, different places. So I think that's worth considering. And then it's just to look at the individual, like we can really deepen our neurosis through practice, particularly as we live in the kind of yoga supermarket now in Australia, England, America, where there's so much good yoga. We can pick one that really suits us, but often people are picking one which is just deepening their pattern. So it might be worth looking at, okay, what's the combination of things, whether it's yoga plus something else other than yoga. If you've done 20 years of Iyengar, like one of my students in Moscow, it's not what she needs anymore. She's exploring other things, and she's still keeping her Iyengar practice because she finds a lot of stability in it, and she finds a lot of, she wants to keep deepening that, but she's supplemented other things because she's realizing that it's made her a little controlling and form bound, and now she's doing some more sort of free movement stuff. And another person might be the opposite. They might be a little bit too, hanging out in Byron Bay and being a bit too free and crazy, and they might need a bit of structure. So this is worth considering, I would say.
So do you think that the students come to you to explore themselves? Is that what because I've been teaching, and I teach seniors, and
Yeah.
Mine don't come, I don't think. Now, and that's not what I'm offering, so I'm not surprised. But,
Yeah.
but do you think that's what they're looking for, is to say, hey, this guy's really got a way for me to explore myself?
Well, I think there's lots of good niches there, and it's really important to know what the aim of your practice is under, inverted commas, yoga, because the structure of what you're doing follows the aim. And while different people can be in the class for different reasons, there's still, there's things you're going to get in a trampolining class you won't get in a swimming pool. And there's different aims for different practices. So is it, basic health? I don't really do that, though. I think it's important. I go to some classes just for health and relaxation. That's another aim. I don't really do relaxation. Like, my classes are deeply confronting. They're not for people who are, they're destabilizing, not stabilizing. So my students, the niche I have is like, hey, if you really want to explore yourself and it's educational, it's not a holiday. It's not like this is going to be a nice, juicy holiday from reality. It's like, this is going to really confront you with yourself, and it's going to teach you useful skills for real life, not pretending we're in Bali, on some kind of holiday. And it's okay to have a holiday in Bali. I did that myself this year, but it's a different aim. So it's like, know what your aim is. I would just ask teachers and have a method that follows that. And we've just really specialized in a lot of things that a lot of yoga teachers do a little bit of. We just say we're totally uninterested in fitness, for example. It's totally not about fitness or stretching in this class. And mindfulness is part of it, but that's not the main focus. That's necessary, but not sufficient in embodied yoga. So it's not for everyone, but I'd say about 10% of yogis tend to be the kind of yogis who've been around a while, who don't want something too esoteric or Eastern, but they do want to go deep. That 10% of yogis absolutely love it. And there's other people that are going to be much happier in sort of bog standard fitness yoga or esoteric Eastern yoga.
Okay. So you said you don't do shavasana at the end? Or did I miss it?
We do Shavasana as a death meditation.
Oh.
So we look at Shavasana as a way to explore what you're dead to in your life, or as a fairly hardcore death meditation. So the reason I wouldn't do that at the end of class is because then people would be like a bit shell-shocked as they went out into their life. Yeah. So I would probably only do that in a workshop, and it would be, we talk about the U-curve. So that's not something you do right at the beginning or right at the end, because it's just not fair to people. It's not kind. Yeah. So we do something intense like that. We do mountain poses, like, what do you stand for in life? That's our mountain pose. And again, that's pretty intense, these simple poses, standing up and lying down. But we do those in the middle of a workshop, because that way people can kind of get prepared for them on the way in, and they've got some assimilation time on the way out. I think yoga tends to do container really well. So the sort of, in a hero's journey, it's the other world, the special world, the unordinary world. And yoga does that really well generally. It has special language, you have a mat, and there's special rules, and there's, on the wall. Maybe you have your special yoga clothes. And that's great, because we all need to go to the special world to do some sort of transformative practice that creates a container, in my language. But then how do we get it back into life? That transfer back, the return home in the hero's journey model, is much trickier. And doing Shavasana at the end of class probably isn't the best way to do that.
Okay. All right. Interesting. I've never heard of that before. We're going to segue a little bit, just because Sure. I think this is interesting. As I said, I was watching you on the YouTube, and one of the things you said was that the guru hippie Gordon Gecko statement about, we've had these gurus, many of whom have been pretty bad, and the hippies that want to do it with their anything goes. In the Gordon Gecko, let's make money at all cost kind of thing. And that's kind of what you were saying you thought yoga had kind of evolved into, probably in the Western world, although I'm kind of wondering if it's not all over. Is that still true for you, or have I misinterpreted what you said?
This is one of my more controversial statements. I said something like, hippies doing a fascist practice in a capitalist way, what could possibly go wrong?
Yes, that's exactly what you said, yes.
Yeah. So if we look at these three main traditions within yoga, these three main value sets, there's a system called spiral dynamics, which kind of cuts them up a little bit, and they're all intermingled, but they're all in yoga in a big way. They each have a positive side and a negative side. So like, if we look at kind of traditions and orthodoxy and lineage, there's a lot of positive stuff there, but it's also essentially the equivalent of the Dark Ages. It's using authority. It's saying authority is what's right. Iyengar put it in his book. It sounds like I'm picking on Iyengar, whoever, Patabi Joyce, whoever. And that's ripe for abuse. And it's not just some teachers from those sort of traditions. It's most teachers from those traditions in the West. Some would say all. in that sort of tradition of, it's right because I say it is, I mean, that's profoundly goes against the whole of Western civilization's knowledge tradition. And then there's the kind of Western approach, which is like to be more critical and to look at evidence. And we see this in, if you look at Ariana Rabinovich's Yoga Myths book, you'll see like a really healthy version of that, like saying, hey, is it really true that, twists detoxify the spine or whatever? Right. And looking at the science and anatomy. So there's a really healthy side to that kind of Enlightenment plus tradition, which is the basis of Western civilization. And there's a negative side, and it tends to come with a kind of consumerism or a kind of capitalist approach. And then there's the kind of postmodern approach, which has the kind of hippie version of, no discipline and no boundaries, and it's all peace and love. But, that can cause problems with the lack of boundaries or the lack of discernment. But there's a really positive side to that too, about emotionality and feeling. And the whole embodiment movement was born through that kind of Esalen West Coast kind of vibe. So there's some real work to be done in integrating that, some of the more positive equality kind of stuff and questioning of some of the dominance hierarchies from the traditionalist value set. So they both have a positive and negative side. And I try and integrate the positive sides of those three value sets and kind of remove some of the negative sides. That's a very long story, very short. I hope that makes some sense to listeners.
Hopefully, yes. So what are those three positive sides? Let's just reduce it down to that.
Yeah, structure, form, and boundaries, and the value of tradition would be the first set. Mm-hmm. So in EYP, for example, there's very definite poses that have a right way and a wrong way of doing them. Yeah. And then the second stage, the modernist stage, we could say the positive is it looks at evidence-based, it looks at logic, it looks at what's reasonable. So, in EYP, people explore things for themselves experientially. They're not just told to believe things because the guru says so. And the positive side of the postmodern stage is, I'd say, questioning of hierarchy, looking at, some equality between people and also a sensitivity. So the feeling, somatic, emotional body comes back online, which the traditionalists don't really give a crap about. So like they're the three positives that I'd say if we could integrate them. This is, based on a lot of stuff by Ken Wilber, if people know Ken. If we can integrate those, we could really get a very modern way of doing yoga. And it doesn't have to be the exact method I'm using. I'm using a particular method. There's lots of other good methods out there. But I'd say yoga for the 21st century. And, a big thing about your podcast is also for all kinds of people, right? Right. Ashtanga was like young men in the Mysore Palace.
Yes.
It's like not so suitable for pensioners. And, my students are working with youth. They're working with sex trafficked prostitutes. They're working in old people's homes. They're working across different cultures, at least, God, I don't know how many countries EYP's taught in now, about 20. They're working with soldiers. They're working with police. They're working with Buddhist centers. They're working with so many diverse groups. And you can only do that if there's a flexibility of approach, and a traditionalist model is never going to have enough flexibility.
Ah, interesting. Okay, well, it's been a very interesting podcast, but is there anything else that you would like the listeners to know that we either haven't covered or haven't covered it enough depth according to...
Oh, there's loads I could say, but if people want more on this, they could look at the ebooks or the podcast, the Embodiment podcast, if they want to sort of widen their perspectives on some of the other embodied arts that are out there, because it's such a huge world. It's very difficult to get even a survey of the field. So I really get why people might just stick to one style. I would say that if you've been in yoga a little while and you're looking for a Western but deep approach, then look up, the Embodied Yoga Principles teachers in the States and Australia and, UK and Russia and other places. They might like that approach, but there's loads of good stuff out there. And, I feel like that we're in a great time in human history where we can travel, a lot of us, where there's loads of stuff online for free, YouTube and all the rest of it. It's an absolute goldmine. So I just feel really grateful that we live in this time where we can, you're there in Australia, I'm here, we're Zooming each other. It's pretty cool, right?
It is cool. Yeah. That's my favorite part of the podcast, is talking to people all over the world. So anyway.
Yeah, I really like that too on my own podcast. It's got so international now. And I'd say culture is another area that's well worth looking at, whether it's coming from an Asian cultural background from yoga or aikido, or whether it's a sort of American take on yoga, which is fairly endemic now in the world. The average British yoga festival will be a third American teachers, a third Indian teachers, and maybe some Brits,
Oh, okay.
Probably no like French, German or Scandinavian, for example, let alone Australian. So I think the cultural piece here is really worth looking at, and there is a cultural body to this. And the other piece would be the trauma piece, like realizing the kind of, the trauma aware, which is I don't feel like I need to talk about a lot, because I feel like that's really coming into yoga now in a big way.
Yes, it is. I've had a lot of trauma podcasts, and they're always listened to it at high rates. So I understand that it's really helpful to people to know about that. Okay, so you were talking about your training, and they could get your training online, or is it face-to-face?
Yeah, there's a few possibilities. So if people want to really deep dive into the embodiment world, they should look up the Embodied Facilitator Course, embodiedfacilitator.com. And that's a year-long course that's multiple perspectives, not just for yoga people, but it's yoga people do it. And that's the kind of biggest thing they can do. And then if they wanted to come to a teacher training, there are various locations around the world. If they go to Embodied Yoga Principles, that's the 4 or 5 days. It's much more doable. That's much more specific, as well as a set of techniques. If they just want to get a load of free cool stuff online, they can look at, which is totally valid, right? Like, why not? Like, let's be generous. Some people just can't afford to go to training. I get it. So they can go to our YouTube channel, which is Yoga in Daily Life, and just get, many, many free YouTube videos, the podcast, the Embodiment podcast. And, the big one, the Embodiment Conference. So that's a free event with 100 speakers. Which is going to be in November, which is absolutely epic. And I think we're expecting 10,000 people. It's going to be a little big. Got a very organized, teacher in charge of it. And that's going to be a great event if people want something free. And then there's Instagram and blah, blah, blah. So yeah, that I hope gives people a spectrum of things they can either spend money on or not.
Okay. And where's the conference?
It's virtual. So that's online. Okay. And it's all time zones. So you won't have to get up at 6 a.m. again.
That would be nice. No, I interview a lot of people from the U.S., so I'm up at 6 a lot. It's okay.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing in Australia.
Yeah.
So it's across time zones. It's all recorded, and it's all absolutely free. So the only thing we're making money from is the recordings, if people want the recordings.
Okay.
But you could access everything for free. So part of my life's mission is making this stuff available to the world. And sometimes you've got to go deep, and for that people have to pay a serious amount of money, because you can't train people easily, and it's my job,
Yep.
And other times, like the conference, we're able to give things away, or the YouTube channel, or the podcast, which thousands of people listen to. So it's just really cool to be able to have that ecosystem of things, some of which are sort of deeper but expensive, and some of which, like the podcast, are completely available to everyone.
All right. And if
people
they wanted to
get on
the online conference, is that through your website, or?
Yeah, through the website. They could just Google the Embodiment Conference.
Okay.
And it would come up. The Embodiment Podcast, Embodiment Yoga. I'm pretty easy to Google, because I've just kept using the same word for everything.
Yes, that's good. Very good branding.
Thank you very much. I teach marketing to my students. There's another huge thing to talk about in terms of yoga, is the sort of stuff around money and marketing, and the weird shadows around that. I've talked on a couple of other podcasts around that. That's a pretty interesting topic.
I've had people that do donation classes or even free classes with foundations behind them or nonprofits, and I've had come back on that, on people saying, "Oh, then you're just devaluing yoga," and it's an interesting discussion. It
is.
I'm not going to say I come down on either side at this point, but but it is becoming.
There's some good conversations happening about our relationship to money as yogis, right?
Yeah.
Coming out of this sort of, monastic traditions and kind of Himalayan cave aesthetic traditions. And, now in the modern world, we've got rent to pay, and it's, I see people go a bit too far, usually one way or the other. They either give everything away for free and live in poverty, or they become kind of really greedy and, kind of like trying to scale all their teacher trainings in such a way that they stop giving value and think either's a problem. And it's a good conversation to be in, for sure.
It is. We'll have to do that someday. Okay. Anything that you would like to add at the end before I give people your contact details?
I'd just say, whatever style of yoga you do, what I do helps people of all different styles, but whatever style you do, make your yoga really meaningful. That's something I'd like to say. It's like, if it doesn't impact your marriage and your work and your intimate relationships and your children and your politics, if it doesn't impact all those things and at least change your corner of the world, then why are we doing it? That's the question I'd just leave people with. And there's a lot of good methods out there if people want to, really want to increase that engagement with life in yoga. Because I don't know about you, but I'm tired of the Instagram of all the handstands on the beach and seeing skinny girls in bikinis. Do you know what I mean? It's like I just don't think that's that interesting. I'm increasingly hearing people out there say, yeah, I want something that's more meaningful than being really flexible.
I agree. And that's why I have this podcast, so that people know
Thank
there's
you.
more than that.
Yeah, thanks for your podcast. Because we're doing things in slightly different ways, but like in terms of the access and working with different groups of people, like it's really nice to see that. Like diversity isn't just having a black woman on the front cover of the yoga thing. Diversity is also like different groups of people being able to access yoga right across the spectrum. I have a friend and she does geek yoga, and she does yoga classes in a Star Wars costume and stuff. It's like it's this, my colleague Pilar, who's doing this work with sex trafficked prostitutes in the Spanish islands. There's a hell of a lot of groups of people that can really benefit from this stuff if we can make it accessible. So thanks for your work in that.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. Thank you. I like what you're doing also, because there's just such a perception of yoga as being the bikini on the beach. and what that does is people say, oh, well, then it's not for me. I can't.
But I tell you what, though, my Instagram picture of me in a bikini in Bali that my wife took has been my most successful ever Instagram picture. So check that out on my Instagram if you want to see a slightly chubby, hairy English bloke in a bikini. Check that shit out, Stephanie.
Okay, well, let's give everybody your Instagram names. I have Wark, W-A-R.
Yeah, it's a spoonerism. So my name is Mark Walsh, and it will come up WALSH. It'll come up from that. But my actual that was taken, so I went for the spoonerism of Walk Walsh. But if people put in Mark Walsh, they'll come up. I'm now an Instagram tart too. So follow me up, baby.
Okay, so everybody, you want another bikini on the Bali beach? Go to Wark Walsh. The Facebook, if you would like to access Mark Facebook, it's at leadership.coach.training.
Yeah, people can follow my personal Facebook, but only if they're not easily offended. I've been on really best behavior tonight. So if you're not easily offended, then you can follow me personally. But if you get upset by things, if you believe in the concept of being offended, do not follow me on Facebook. Just try. Not good.
Okay. So there, you've all had your warning. YouTube is Integration Training.
That's right. That's my business name, but we use that for the channel. Yeah.
Yeah. And so your website is www.embodiment.com.
No, Embodied Yoga Principles. Is it .com or .co.uk? It's embodiedyogaprinciples.com, which is the yoga related site, or the bigger course is embodiedfacilitator.com. But just type in embodiment plus duckbill platypus plus bananarama plus anything, and I'll probably come up.
Okay. I want to do duckbill platypus myself.
Do that.
Anyway.
Do it now. I want to see what happens.
It works.
There's a little Antipodean reference for you.
Yes, I know. Okay. Well, Mark, it's been very interesting. You are a great podcast interviewee, so I appreciate it. And so everybody, if you want to get into Embodied Principles a bit more, he's got a free conference online, and you could start there. Thank you, Mark, so much for being on the podcast.
Stephanie, it was a load of fun at the end of a long day at the beginning of yours, so I hope you have a good day. It was a lot of fun. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful interview. If you would like to be a guest on Changing the Face of Yoga, please go to my website, www.yogalightness.com.au, and under the Changing the Face of Yoga tab, you can complete Be Our Guest form. After reviewing the form and finding it applicable to this podcast, we will send you a link to schedule an interview. Please download, review, and tell your friends of any podcasts that are of interest to you and to them. If you would like to contact me, send an email to info@yogalightness.com.au. And thank you for listening to Changing the Face of Yoga.